as we started to see hints of in the last module, the integration of transportation and land use is not just about enabling residents to get around the city using public transportation. It's concerned with improving street-level conditions so more people will walk or bike within a neighborhood, shop locally, and socialize with those around them. In order to do this, planners need to think about how to create safe and inviting spaces at the street level. So let's talk about general guidelines when planning for pedestrians and cyclists. The widespread adoption of cars as the main mode of transport not only changed the way people moved around the city, the density and look of the urban areas, and how spread out our regions became, but over time, the car has changed the way buildings are constructed and how they function relative to the space they occupy. As the car became more ubiquitous, buildings became shorter, sometimes single-story, losing traditional office and apartment space above as they got pushed farther away from the street to accommodate more and more parking. Adding more and more space between the street and buildings to add more parking led to further reductions in density, which in turn required the use of personal automobiles for more trips. The lower densities and increased rates of car usage reduced the feasibility of public transportation. As fewer public transport options were available, more people used cars as a primary mode, requiring more parking. This is the vicious cycle of auto ownership that we talked about earlier in the course. It is also an example of the interaction between transportation and land use. This interaction can go both ways. We can increase densities, reduce parking and reduce car usage, enhance public transportation, and encourage active travel modes through careful planning. Let's talk about how we can plan for walking and cycling. The interaction between transportation and land use is such that if we plan for better land uses, we'll enhance the pedestrian experience. This means doing things like zoning neighborhood centers so they're no more than about 1.5 kilometers apart. If we zone them at this distance, it's a fairly easy walk for your average pedestrian to get from one location to another. This alone makes the city much more accessible for those on foot. And while we're putting residential uses closer together, we might as well add better, higher density retail. This will allow residents to complete a larger number of trips in a single walk than they would if things were spread much further apart at lower densities. Mixing things within a retail district or some sort of commercial district is also another way to encourage active travel. If you think back to cities before cars were everywhere, most of our small towns and cities had commercial centers that were the main place for commercial activity. They were also the place for residents to socialize and spend extra time outside of the house. This kind of inviting atmosphere encourages people to take to their feet rather than their car. And within these more pedestrian-oriented developments, there should be no car-dependent land uses. That means no big box retail that's so far set back that you need a car to get from the end of the parking lot to the doors of the retail franchise, that schools and offices are close enough together that you can walk or take public transportation, that you don't need to get in your car and drive for 45 minutes to reach any one of these activities.
A section of a busy street in Auckland's city centre has been transformed to be a little more pedestrian-friendly. It's a trial phase of a wider plan to make the CBD more walkable, but some businesses are sounding a note of caution about changing the cityscape. Our reporter Chen Liu has the story.
There are 60,000 people who call Auckland city centre home, and every day more than 100,000 people travel into the city. It took only 3 nights for High Street to be transformed between Shortland Street and Vulcan Lane. Pot plants line the northern end of High Street, and car parks have been replaced with loading zones. Auckland Mayor Phil Goff says it's going to make a difference for those who use the street the most.
You bring your shoulders in to walk down some of those areas of High Street because it's only a metre wide, and then you get here and then people can go back to being people, and you feel that this is an area that's made for you and not an area that just you're dodging the pedestrians and you're dodging the cars.
The land use issues, including spacing and density, are not the only part of what makes somebody want to get out of their car and walk around a town or a community. Even those who might ordinarily not give a second thought to getting in their car to look around and think about potentially making a trip by foot. That sort of change in environment starts with the buildings that front streets. We should establish build-to lines along the primary roads so that the frontage of the building is up to or next to the sidewalk rather than set farther back from the street. That means forbidding the placement of parking between the front doors of the building and the sidewalk or the street. And if you've spent some time in the CBD and then in the suburbs, you no doubt are familiar with the way entrances to buildings are directly off the sidewalk in the CBD. And when we travel out to the suburbs, where things become much less dense, buildings are often surrounded by parking lots. And if you're a pedestrian, you must first navigate that parking lot before you can even enter the building. And once buildings are closer to the street and to the sidewalk, it's important to keep the front door of that building in a place that's easily accessible for pedestrians, which usually means the primary door needs to be on the primary street frontage, not around some alley, not to the back where the parking lot might be, not through a parking garage, which is fairly typical, but directly on the frontage of the street. And in non-commercial areas or more residential locations, parking should be located in the back of the house and accessed through an alley, rather than curb cuts along the street crossing the sidewalk. Not only is that dangerous for pedestrians and young children that might be on bikes, but it also reduces the available density for houses, as lots need to be larger to accommodate the extra driveway space and garage space. Densities can only reach a certain level to accommodate that additional space requirement. Along with this is making buildings pleasant to interact with as a pedestrian. So we should require frequent doors along commercial streets and set minimum spacing standards so that we don't have big blank walls of space in a busy, bustling commercial area, that we don't have to walk for blocks and blocks before we can access one building or another building. In commercial areas, buildings that have large inactive spaces like parking garages or large big box stores to be wrapped around more active ground level uses such as shops and walk-up residential units. In the United States, this is frequently referred to as the Texas donut, and it's a fairly common building practice in commercial areas in recent years in mixed-use commercial areas. To enhance the pedestrian environment, we can get down into very specific details, such as setting minimum requirements for the spacing and size of windows, particularly on the ground floor. We call this fenestration requirements, where we set the size of commercial windows and spacing so that individuals walking by will have a pleasant environment. They can peek inside shops and feel like they're not walking along a warehouse district. A common sight in many large cities, and especially older cities, is the use of roll-down doors to protect the entrance at night or when the building is closed. These kinds of roll-down doors tend to block pedestrians' views of shops and make the area feel less used, less safe, and less attractive to the pedestrian. Those sorts of things should be replaced with opaque gates if necessary, or no gates at all. Up until the mid-part of the 20th century, people would spend lots of time on their front porch or their front lawn. Houses didn't frequently have air conditioning, so it was more comfortable to spend time sitting on your front porch than hidden away in your hot house. As time went on and the suburbs expanded and backyards got larger, the outdoor space moved from the front yard to the backyard. And so people were hidden away from the street level, rarely seeing their neighbors, rarely interacting with their neighborhood. In order to promote a more friendly pedestrian environment, we should move stoops and front porches to the front of houses in residential areas. One of the most dangerous experiences for a pedestrian is walking down a bustling street on a sidewalk and having cars swerve in and out of parking lots and parking structures on their way to shopping. These set up environments that are simply unsafe and unattractive for pedestrians. So zoning codes ought to forbid parking entries along retail streets and minimize the width of garage doors along all streets except for alleys, making it easier for pedestrians to cross where there is a parking entrance necessary and providing more space for the pedestrian to walk down the street without encountering such a curb cut. Lighting can be such an important aspect of the pedestrian experience for feeling safe and welcome to outdoor and indoor space alike. We should provide a consistent level of lighting for the pedestrian realm without glare or shadow. Shadows often evoke the idea that someone might be lying and hiding, and so if we want people to experience the outdoors and get outside of their car, we must be sure that there are no spaces where people may have that perception. We could use full spectrum lighting to accomplish this, particularly in commercial areas, so that pedestrians can see colors accurately and it feels attractive. There's nothing worse than that old sodium light where everything looked orange and at the right lighting conditions, everything else lost its color. And also we can celebrate the street and our infrastructure with interesting and attractive and artful light.
It's time to learn about the elements that make a sidewalk better for everyone. There's the elements of accessibility, safety, comfort, scale, and convenience.
Accessible sidewalks can be used by nearly anyone and follow the 8 to 80 rule. They have features such as lowered curbs at intersections, rumble strips to alert people they're approaching the street, and plenty of benches and shade for pedestrians to rest. Sidewalks should also be safe for users. Studies show that raised, curbed sidewalks provide a buffer from cars that make accidents that do happen less deadly. There's also new technology making sidewalks safer, such as these light-up curb strips that work to turn lanes into crosswalks and alert pedestrians on their phones as to whether or not it's safe to cross. Not all sidewalk designs will work for every street. Sidewalks should be human-sized and appropriate for each area. Sidewalks that are really wide in a low-traffic area can feel underutilized or sterile, while narrow sidewalks in areas of high usage can become congested and deter people from walking. It may be necessary to monitor sidewalks and their usage and make sure that the scale is appropriate and meeting the needs of the neighborhood.
One way to determine how to ensure the safety of pedestrians and make sure we have the infrastructure that encourages the free movement of pedestrians is through tracking surveys. And these tools allow us to figure out where pedestrians want to go and then build the infrastructure to ensure that they can safely cross those areas. We call these desire lines or desire paths. And so what happens is a small team of observers will go out into the field and record over a few hours or a few days the actual pedestrian walking patterns of an intersection or a neighborhood, and then that data will be aggregated into one map. That map will then be used to better understand where new pedestrian signals or crossings should be installed. It's also a good way to know where to put in new traffic calming measures such as medians and curb extensions, and where those extensions are best placed, whether that is at the ends of the block or mid-block or somewhere in between. And this also will help us determine where existing asphalt might be built out to absorb pedestrian and vehicle flow more safely. So if we know there's an area where pedestrians frequently cross, and also it's a high interaction area with cars, we can ensure that at least the pavement under the ground will not be unsafe for pedestrians and create tripping hazards.
If you've walked across a school or office campus or through a shopping center, you've probably noticed little paths like this. Perhaps you took the shortcut through the bushes instead of staying on the formal brick path. Or maybe you shook your head at the thoughtless cretins who trampled through the landscaping just to shave a few seconds off of their walk. These rogue paths have been called desire lines, desire paths, cow paths, and they've had a surprising influence on the technology we use every day. In 1998, Dutch architect Rem Koolhaas won a fiercely competitive bid to design a new building at the Illinois Institute of Technology. It would be his first project in the United States. This is what he designed. Back in 1997, he had a team go and observe the way students moved across campus, the way they cut to and from residence halls and academic buildings across this lot under the train tracks. He used those desire lines to inform the interior layout of the building, which won wide critical acclaim at its unveiling. Schools from the University of Maryland to UC Berkeley to Virginia Tech, Ohio State, all have some version of this lore. The campus was pathless until students formed their own paths, which were later formalized by bricks.
A few smaller details to enhance the pedestrian experience and encourage walking include things like having the proper overall width for sidewalks or footpaths. The wider the sidewalk or footpath, and the less narrowing that happens in and out of each block, the more likely people will be encouraged to use that facility. Very narrow sidewalks are very difficult for larger crowds to cross, and it will likely result in people either entering the street to pass each other, which presents a safety hazard, or making people not use that path altogether. And while sidewalks may seem like some of the simplest infrastructure we have in a city, there's actually a lot to it and a science behind it. There's multiple parts to a sidewalk, and we call each of these sidewalk zones. So there's a few zones, starting where the sidewalk meets a building. This is called the frontage zone. We try to keep it clear from pedestrians so that people going in and out of buildings have a clear entry onto the sidewalk and doors don't bump into people as they are opened. Just outside of that frontage zone is the throughway zone. The throughway zone is where we have the most movement of pedestrians. They walk back and forth and cross each other on a frequent pace and don't face a lot of obstructions or obstacles on their path. Next to the throughway zone, and we're getting closer to the street now, is the furnishing zone. And this is where we try to encourage outdoor dining and a more lively experience on the street. So chairs and tables, maybe benches are set up. These areas frequently are interrupted with planters and trees that make the experience even more inviting, but still allow room within the throughway zone for passersby. At the edge of the sidewalk itself, and where often parking will start, is called the edge zone. There's typically not much here, but it's a little bit of a buffer, especially if there's on-street parking at this location where cars may bump into the edge or the curb or even come up on the edge a little bit. It's a safety zone for pedestrians. Finally, there's the extension zone. And in the extension zone, there's typically parking, there may be bike lanes or even bus lanes, and sometimes there's bump outs to curbs that will slow down traffic and also help pedestrians cross the street faster.
What makes up a sidewalk? Well, it can help to think of a sidewalk like a tunnel with walls and a floor.
Now, there are two walls in a sidewalk. There's the service zone and the transition zone. The service zone is where amenities like benches, trash cans, and access to crosswalks are. The transition zone is a space where sidewalks interact with the street wall, giving pedestrians access to buildings and shops. Then there's the floor, also called the free zone. This is where planners have the most control. The floor is where pedestrians get to move around, walk, dance, or meet with each other. It's the area most important to the basic function of a sidewalk, though all areas should be considered when making the best sidewalk possible.
If we zoom out of the sidewalk itself a little bit, there's a lot going on at the street level and intersection level. At the very corner of sidewalks is the corner zone, and we try to keep those very clear so that a larger number of people can gather there as they try to safely cross the street. If it's a multimodal street, we have transit zones that are kept free from parking so that buses can load and unload without impeding traffic and providing pedestrians a clear way to enter that bus without having to get onto the street. We typically will include accessible parking and passenger loading so that people who need a little bit more time entering and exiting a vehicle will not impede traffic, and then driveway zones where we try to keep that clear of trees and anything that might obstruct a view so that cars, if they do have to cross a sidewalk, have a very clear view of pedestrians.